So the Energy and Telecoms Minister Vaz has responded to the Auditor General's report with the findings that he breached procurement rules, and his reaction is he would do it again. I'm Dion Jacques Miller. Thank you so much for joining me. Time for tea. Alright, so you remember during the height of the hurricane relief program when they had all those press conferences, and I went to several of them and I kept asking about an independent oversight committee, and the information minister kept giving me a bag of excuse and a bag of argument that yeah man, them are going to set up an independent oversight committee, except that never happened. And we then heard that the Auditor General was going to be doing what she called a real-time audit, looking at what the hurricane relief program was like. And I did say at the time it did give me some comfort to know that at least her office was overlooking the process. So her office did recently put out a report, and it's an important report. It raises some concerns, including concerns about how ODPEM, the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, has been operating. Not a video for that, but I want to concentrate in this video on this issue of the Starlink internet devices, the role of Minister Vaz, and his responses. Okay, so let's go to the issue in the report of the Starlink devices. Another time, as I said, we pick up on the others, all right? So the report said this. We noted that the procurement of 200 Starlink devices valuing $12.12 million was initiated by way of a ministerial instruction and not by the Director General of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, and this contravened, the report says, the Public Procurement Act 2015, which assigns direct responsibility for all procurement activities to the head of the procuring entity. In other words, the Starlink devices were being bought by ODPEM. The instruction should have come from the head of ODPEM, not from the minister. So the report went on to say, our review of correspondence revealed that the procurement activity was initiated by a letter from the Minister of Energy, Transport and Telecoms in his capacity as co-chair of the Relief and Recovery Oversight Committee on November 13, 2025, to the attention of the Director General for payment to be made by ODPEM for the 200 devices. However, only the head of the entity is legally empowered to initiate procurement, and there is no provision under the Public Procurement Act that allows the Minister to approve or initiate commitments to select suppliers or vendors or give any directive to ODPEM as to which supplier to pay. The Starlink devices were bought using funds from the $350 million withdrawal requested by the Financial Secretary, but they were not listed among the items that supported this request. Then no. The devices were delivered to the Office of Commissioner of Police on November 14. However, it was noted that ODPEM began to prepare the required procurement documentation on November 19, 5 days after the devices were delivered. The requisition form was created retrospectively, meaning after them they don't get the device them already. So it was created retrospectively to formalize the process, just so that the paperwork would be in order for the stuff that had already been bought. The report said our review determined that 120 devices were distributed among 17 entities. Of these, 13 of the entities confirmed receiving a total of 86 devices, but then the Auditor General's team went to physically check on the devices because that's part of the audit process, and they said physical inspections at 8 entities showed all 41 issued devices unused and in storage. Additionally, 5 entities did not record the Starlink devices in their asset inventories. 3 municipal corporations reported that the devices had not been entered into municipal inventory listings but were issued directly to the respective councils, so their inventory records didn't show them as having had them at all. Conversely, Customs indicated that although the agency got 3 devices, measures are being implemented to render them operational. Customs said that the devices' power supplies are of European specs, so they need power adapters to meet local requirements, and that would be at an additional cost. And then the Auditor General says when they looked at 41 devices, they saw that all the units were equipped with European 2-pin electrical plugs requiring adapters for use. As of January 6, 2026, 80 out of 200 Starlink devices remained in storage at the Jamaica Constabulary Force. So when that came out now, the minister issued an initial response, and this is what he said. He said he strongly rejects any suggestion of wrongdoing for what he called his justifiable actions. Then he spoke about the context, Hurricane Melissa, catastrophic damage, people didn't have internet, people were desperate to communicate with loved ones. He then says the Auditor General's claim that my involvement breached Section 20 of the Public Procurement Act 2015, which assigns sole responsibility for procurement activities to the head of the procuring entity, is both uninformed and grossly inaccurate. Stick a pin, listen closer to that because we're going to come back to that. Uninformed, he calls the Auditor General, and grossly inaccurate. Well, he calls what she said. He said it must be noted that all actions taken were in keeping with the guidance note on the acquisition of goods, services, and works in the situation of emergency or extreme urgency issued by the Office of Public Procurement Policy. In keeping with the guidance note, there can be no doubt that the requirements for employing emergency procurement procedures were satisfied. He said these requirements are a genuine situation of emergency or urgency and the necessity of the procurement activity. Okay, so the response from the minister is strange to say the very, very least, because he says the actions were taken in accordance with this guidance note. And he also said the Auditor General's findings and conclusions were, quote, uninformed and grossly inaccurate. But what was inaccurate and what was uninformed? Because when you look at the guidance note that he is referencing, this is what the note says. It says situations of emergency or extreme urgency require swift and decisive action. He says, as outlined in Section 20 of the Act, quote, the head of every procuring entity shall have overall responsibility for the conduct of all processes connected with procurement. Consequently, in a situation of emergency or extreme urgency, the head of a procuring entity should organize the procurement processes of the entity so as to enable a swift and decisive response in keeping with the law and guidelines issued by the Office of Public Procurement Policy. So what the guidance note is saying is that in times of emergency, yes, you have to move fast, but you know who is supposed to move fast? The head of the entity, the head of the procuring entity. Now, say nothing about the minister. Right? So the guidance note that the minister is referencing to justify what he did specifically says it's the head of the entity that's supposed to do this stuff, not him. Now, he went on in his press release, that first press release, and he said this. He said, acting in my capacity as co-chair of the Relief and Recovery Oversight Committee, I took a decision that ensured that government was able to secure the available devices quickly and have them distributed in the quickest possible manner. The procurement of the devices was possible as a result of the swift and decisive actions taken, and I make no apologies for that. He says, this was done in my capacity as co-chair and minister with responsibility for telecommunications. The devices were procured via the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management. Except the guidance note, though, specifically spells out measures to allow for quick and decisive action, right? It specifically allows for quick approvals by the head of the agency and emergency procurement when you have a disaster. That's what the note was written to do. The minister is not an expert on procurement because ministers are not supposed to do procurement. Also, we were told that the new head of ODPEM, when he was appointed, we're told he's an expert in logistics. So surely he should have been able to figure out how to do this procurement in the shortest possible time. And of course, there are always experts he can draw on as well. What is happening here is that the minister is using bluster to distract from the fact that what he did was wrong. He wasn't supposed to do it. That's not what the process says. What is basically happening is that, like when he was in Parliament shouting the people want light, this is essentially shouting the people want internet to justify bypassing the procedure. Now, he spoke about the issue again at a press briefing.
I have taken note of the public commentary since the release of the AG's report on the Starlink procurement and my subsequent press release. While I believe the issue has boiled down to the fact that I directed the procurement of Starlink devices rather than the head of the agency, I wish to make the following clear. This was not by chance on the following basis. I was clear on the advice of the Attorney General's chambers. The Director General was newly appointed to the position in an overwhelming situation of a major national disaster just days ahead. ODPEM was in the midst of coordinating overall response to all the relief efforts taking place in Jamaica. This matter was time sensitive and of an urgent nature, of an alternative measure of connectivity and communication based on disruption, which was severely hampering the relief efforts, including search and rescue, evacuation, food and medical assistance. Using my discretion and exercising my judgment as Minister of Telecommunications as well as co-chair of the Cabinet Subcommittee in charge of relief and recovery in the aftermath of a Category 5 hurricane disaster, allowed me to easier access the scarce supply of Starlink devices, negotiate the best prices, as reports of price gouging had already emerged to get access to Starlink devices ahead of the paperwork processing for direct procurement. Therefore, getting the devices deployed into the field to improve the government's efficiency response to the recovery efforts, allow the affected persons to communicate with family and loved ones, allow the access of cash from ATMs in the severely affected areas, allow for first responders to coordinate response in the affected areas, to include elected representatives, councillors, MPs, police and military personnel, police stations, JDF field operations, just to name a few. And to say, despite all of the commentary, there was no implication of corruption in this matter. I wish to make it abundantly clear my respect for the Auditor General's department and the Auditor General and the work it is mandated to do. But I maintain this is a national disaster. Extreme times require practical and prudent actions. And as a senior legislator and Minister of Government, I am always reminded that I'm under duty to uphold the Constitution and laws of Jamaica, for which I fully respect.
So that response doesn't really answer the questions and concerns that the Auditor General had raised. Anyway, he was asked again.
To Minister Vaz, your initial response to the Auditor General's report on Starlink was one of complete rejection. This morning, you seem to be almost going back on what you're saying with a clarification. Are you now accepting the fact that you did in fact breach the procurement guidelines?
Thank you very much. My press release stated my position. What I'm commenting on now is the commentary that has taken place subsequent to that, and the fact that it has boiled down to the question as to whether or not, as minister leading the procurement, that was a breach or not. My position is very simple. I'm justifying my position while basically paying respect to the AG's department and her for her job that she does, because I do not wish to become in a controversial position with any agency of government. My position remains that I justified today why I did it, because I believe it's important to clear the noise so that people hear from me directly as to the position that I have taken. It's a very simple position. I didn't have to comment, but that's not my nature.
So just to follow up, is that yes, you accept that you breached the procurement guidelines?
I accept fully what was said by the AG in relation to me getting involved in the procurement. However, what I'm saying is that in a national emergency, I did what I needed to do as Minister of Telecommunications and Minister and co-chair of the Advisory Committee for Relief and Recovery for Hurricane Melissa. I will say it again, if unfortunately next year, Hurricane Daryl or Hurricane Dana comes, and I find myself in the same position, yes, I will have to get written up again. Extreme times require extreme actions. People suffering, people to be evacuated, search and rescue, can't wait on a procurement process that takes weeks, especially when you have an AGC advice that you can go to direct processing. If I didn't do what I did, those Starlinks would not get into the system for at least 1 month in a national disaster.
So the response to this really has been unfortunate. The Auditor General put out a good report raising legitimate concerns. What is happening is that those concerns are basically being dismissed, while the minister responsible is just saying, boy, I'm going to do it again. In the meantime, no other response from anybody in government on this. The minister says there's no indication of corruption, and we've heard this from other ministers when these reports come out. That's not the only issue. A big issue is the issue of efficiency as well, how government is supposed to work and how things are supposed to be done. The fact that there is no evidence of theft or corruption doesn't mean that there isn't a problem. These firewalls are put in place to keep the politicians out of certain areas of operation, and there is good reason for that. We all know that, right? Doesn't matter what was in Mr. Vaz's mind or what his good intentions were. The system is set up that way for a purpose, because we've seen what happens in the past when politicians get involved in these things. So bypassing procedure is an issue, and efficiency is always an issue, because there has been no response so far to those concerns that have been raised by the Auditor General. The minister is making it look like, say, boy, things needed to be done, so he got involved and things were done. Okay, well, tell us then, how is it that the Starlink devices have been locked away in storerooms while thousands of Jamaicans have been without internet for months? That sound efficient? Explain to us how Starlink devices were sitting there because there were no adapters to make them work so they could be plugged in. That sound efficient? Not to mention the very serious concerns about how ODPEM has been operating. As I said, that needed its own video. Whenever questions were raised about how the hurricane relief program was going, we got a whole bag of chat about how everything is being accounted for, everything is being done by the book, and clearly that isn't so. The Auditor General has shown that very, very clearly, and has also shown that we have not got value for money in terms of things being bought, being used for its intended purpose. Or the Starlink device, them wouldn't they sit down in a storeroom when how much Jamaican there without internet? And as I said, anytime you ask a question, you got a bag of chat saying, yeah man, everything is fine. And all we're now getting is, well, I would do it again. It was justified. I stand by what I did. And the minister is dismissing questions that are being raised, legitimate questions, legitimate concerns, as noise. And by the way, minister, you owe the Auditor General an apology. So what do you think, folks? Comment below, alright? Like the video, share it with somebody who might be interested, and subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you know anytime I drop a new video. I'm Dion. Thank you so much for watching. Back to my tea.